Well, so excited to have you guys both join us here at CES in Las Vegas with Women in Drones. We want to talk a lot about BVLOS right now, and you're both experts in it. So both Robin Murphy and Eileen Lockhart are with us. So can we just start and you tell us a little bit more about your background and
Sure.
How did you get here? What you been doing?
Well, it's kind of a funny story. So I started my career at Xcel Energy, and I was in a supportive role. And I read an article in a magazine and learned about drone technology. I don't have any aviation background, I don't have any military background, and I decided that it was a good idea for the company to figure out how to incorporate them. And I took it as a growth and development role and build a brand new division at Xcel Energy. And we ended up being one of the very first operators that fly beyond the line of sight across 10 states, and now today I recently left Xcel and I'm with a global operator that flies drones.
Yeah. Okay. And how long have you been in the industry?
10 years.
10 years now.
Yeah,
wow.
10 years.
So you've been around for a little bit. You've been able to see kind of this evolution and this growth.
That's right.
Wonderful. Robin, tell us a little bit more about your background and how did you get here?
Well, I had a very circuitous route as well. I specialize in artificial intelligence and robotics for disasters, and I've been working in that area since 1995. And I've been working with drones since the late 1990s when I was put on the DARPA Micro Aerial Vehicles program on their technical advisory board, back when drones were just like crazy talk. And so we started using drones, pushing the small ones for disasters, such that we led the first use, which was at Hurricane Katrina. Mm-hmm. And right after Hurricane Katrina, we hosted a workshop for the FAA to talk about the role of AI, autonomy, cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. And right after that workshop, pretty much everybody in the FAA that participated in that workshop retired. Mm-hmm. So,
job well done.
Yeah. That wasn't what we were aiming for.
Right.
But anyway, I've been in 22 disasters where I or my team have deployed drones for use by the emergency responding agencies.
Wow.
Fantastic.
Yeah, this is what an incredible use of drones, and for all the right reasons, an incredible priority for why drones should be able to operate in the national airspace with a lot of approval. Because my company, we've flown during those times, and it's so critical. But there's also all the infrastructure around it, which is a whole other ball of wax. I want to get into that. So, Eileen, with Spright's key priority of safe integration of UAS into the airspace for long linear infrastructure inspections, what's happening with BVLOS in your neck of the woods?
So it's kind of interesting. So Spright is a division of Air Methods Corporation, which Air Methods owns and operates the world's largest civilian fleet. And so Spright is their drone division, and they have a grand vision of not only flying for critical infrastructure, but also flying for medical package delivery. Mm-hmm. And all of that is based upon safety. And so as a worldwide civilian fleet operator, we are interested in flying certified, qualified, reliable aircraft and scaling that across the global footprint. Mm-hmm. So what are we doing today at Spright? We are certifying our aircraft. Mm-hmm. We are applying for long-range BVLOS. We are supporting utility infrastructure companies by really getting what they need from an engineering perspective, and marrying the engineering data with the aviation component, and disrupting traditional inspections. The utility industry, these are dangerous jobs. You're by high voltage power lines. Absolutely. And so flying a drone to perform an inspection or some sort of assessment makes a lot of sense. So Spright is very much invested in making that work on a global scale.
Wow.
Yeah.
This is definitely a use case that is a priority, and eventually I think they're just all going to be flying around autonomously and doing this on
you betcha.
Totally get that. And Robin, tell us about TAMU's involvement with BVLOS testing. And, you know, what does that mean for the industry based on what you guys have seen as it relates to results in this space?
Well, we haven't been doing a lot of BVLOS testing. I mean, the university has, we're part of one of the FAA Centers of Excellence. But in the field of disaster robotics, it's much more up in the air. And that's because the use cases for BVLOS depend. So if you're looking at the initial emergency response, life-saving response phase, well, that, you know, you'd like to look forward as far as you can, but usually the airspace is heavily congested. Right. There are a lot of news helicopters, there's the military helicopters, we got this, we got looky-loos, we have people trying to sneak in and get, you know, assessment of the damage for their house, and sure, everybody reads those NOTAMs and TFRs. Right. But then you go to a rural area where there's no air traffic, so then it makes a lot of sense. Then you can safely go around. And another one is if you're looking at a wildfire, no one's allowed to fly at night, you know, and typically not even the drug dealers fly over some of the areas. So that's a perfect time to go as far as you can and to give eyes on for the responders who have never had that information and allow them to update their plans overnight so they're ready to go with the latest information first thing in the morning rather than midday, discover everything had changed. So it just depends, but the key emphasis in emergency response is safety. You don't want to make that disaster worse. So you don't want to have, even though the helicopter and everybody, and we're all going to be UTM or whatever, things happen. And that's why we tell people, even if you've got the BVLOS waiver, keep eyes on, particularly in the response phase.
For both of you, and Robin, you still have the mic, what are the biggest challenges that you see with BVLOS? I mean, you know, it's something that I lose sleep about every night. You know, how is this going to work? Some testing that we're about to do. How does, you know, what are the biggest challenges and hurdles that you see beyond just the flight in and of itself?
Why don't you go first? Because the technical challenges, it's not so much a technical challenge, it's a socio-technical system challenge.
So I think Nick and Marilyn really touched on a lot of it. It's there are so many challenges, so many challenges. Everything from the regulation, like we discussed this last session, to cyber security, to physical security, even the communication and control links is a challenge. You know, you have to have a way to control your aircraft if you're flying remotely 100, 500, 1,000 miles, right? And miniaturizing that in the UAS space has been a challenge.
It has.
So I think that it's a combination of supply chain, lack of standards, lack of regulation, lack of bandwidth, lack of, you know, transparency. You know, there's various different government organizations that are working very hard to get this done, but you know, a lot of times the right hand doesn't talk to the left hand. So I would say the challenges are across the board, and like Lori was saying, it will take all of us to really solve this problem.
And not to mention equipment and battery life.
Oh, I mean right.
Will this be electric at some point?
Right. Is it going to be hybrid? Is it gas? What is it? Right. Yep. How are you going to see it? How do you know? Can you look behind yourself? You know, there's just a million different nuances that I think people they take for granted.
Absolutely.
When they're talking about beyond the site.
Absolutely. I mean, this is like everything else that we've talked about. This is layered and nuanced to the umpteenth degree. So, you know, Robin, with that, what are your thoughts on type cert aircraft and the FAA's ability to validate against those current standards? I know we talked to Marilyn a little bit about that. What are your thoughts on that?
And that gets back to what I was going to follow up with you on that, is that autonomy is underrated. I mean, these systems are actually, a lot of times, speaking on behalf of robots everywhere, are often smarter than the person. Yeah. And this emphasis of having a person in the loop doesn't always work very well. Right. But and you see that show up in the type certs, and you also see, you know, a lot of the type certs are like for delivery. And this gets back to my point about it. It may not be the technology as much as it is the workspace or use case. So in disasters, we're like, Why aren't they using delivery more? And we get like tons of people who've done excellent work, like you can take the GIS and say, okay, this area is going to need medical delivery here, and da-da-da, and then you start going, well, okay, so how does it know that's a good place? Oh, it's right there at an intersection. How do you know nobody's going to drive over it? Murphy's Law, if there's a way for it to go wrong. How do you know that anybody can actually get to it?
Right.
Are there trees down? How do the people who need the diabetes medicine or the ambulatory, who actually knows this is showing up here? So now you've got all of these back things going on that can interfere whether or not it's useful, even though the technology might be there. And I think that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen existing delivery capabilities actually get adopted by emergency managers, because we just don't have those type of thing. I consider it that sometimes in drones, we skip the crawling and walking step and go, oh, run, shiny, shiny,
right.
And forget to work through these complex systems and go.
No, I think we're trying to do so much, and everybody's over-promising what can be done, and it's like, oh, but that one snag is a big snag.
Well, and you made me think of something. When I was at Excel, I was begging for drone operators and reliable aircraft. It was such a hard space to navigate what aircraft I wanted to use to perform these valuable inspections, right? And looking back at it now, there's not a lot of motivation for manufacturers to go through this type certification process, because the FAA hasn't really figured out what the process is. There's 800 different, designs, probably even more, like we heard earlier today. So it is an enormous challenge for just the regulator to figure out, how can I ensure and put my safety stamp on this particular battery when there's so much supply chain issues. And back to my point of the lack of motivation from a manufacturer perspective. We're flying drones today that are not type certified. We're flying experimental aircraft.
Yes.
We are flying all kinds of things, and so there's no incentive per se. So that's why I think it's going to take companies like Spright and UPS and Amazon to really push the ball forward and enforce the safety piece.
An 87-pound ball forward. We're going to deliver. No, we can do 5 pounds of a package with an 87-pound drone. No problems.
Exactly. I'm like, I was talking to somebody and we were having that same subject. They're like, well, if we just had a bigger aircraft. And I was like, you mean like a commercial jet?
Yeah.
We could actually ship packages from across the country?
Yeah.
And they were just like, yeah. And so, speaking of emergency management, these are the challenges, and we want these units to be workhorses.
Right.
But how do we do that? And of course, with American manufacturers, starting to rise, this will be very interesting to see how this works. There's a lot of stuff out there,
right?
And not all of it is type certified, and so a lot of companies will be very leery of people using that, because it's like, that looks really interesting, but that doesn't really give me any confidence that this is safe and that this is going to operate effectively.
Yeah.
On that note, one of the things that we talked about here is, in addition to emergency management, is healthcare. And what's your vision, Eileen, of what this is going to look like when it comes to the healthcare industry?
Well, honestly, I think in the healthcare industry, it's people want to know that their pharmaceuticals or their organs or their blood or whatever that they're getting is going to be delivered in a safe manner. So I think it goes back to enforcing type certification, reliable aircraft systems. No matter how, if you're using trains, planes, automobiles to get there, we want to have a system that works, that can save lives. And so, it's really about just pushing the ball forward and being innovative, like all of us are, and getting the standards worked out, getting a path forward worked out, getting to a level of agreement. And we will see a transformation in the healthcare industry. There is no doubt about it. And I think drones and AEM and all of these new technologies will play a major, major role. I also think it's transformational for linear infrastructure inspection, because none of this works without power. And so they all have the same vision as well. We want a safe, aircraft that I can put my safety stamp on, and I'm not going to worry it's going to crash, and that is critical for moving this forward, I think. And I actually really believe that this is the beginning step to AAM and AVTOLs and, you know, people flying cars and things like that. So we have to get this done, and we have to figure this out before we can really massively scale it.
Let me dive a little bit deeper on that one, and I think Marilyn and Nick talked about this as well. Do you see this really being set up first in a rural environment where there's a lack of these resources?
I do, personally.
And maybe distribution centers where they can pull from these things? Because getting from, let's say, Atlanta to 30 to 40 miles away, that's going to provide perhaps some limitations. I know AAM could probably, handle that with maybe a 75-mile radius. But do you see,
I do. First? Honestly, I personally and professionally do think that the rural communities they need it the most right now. There's a lot of challenges, both on the medical delivery side and on the power delivery side. And so it's a safe testing environment, per se, to fly. There's less people, there's less consequences. So I believe that, yes, it's going to start in the rural environment, and it'll eventually grow as people's confidence grow and their trust grows within the technology.
Robin, do you agree?
And I'm going to push back on that. And I agree.
Please.
So that's the logical thing. So we, for the last 2.5 years, have been studying how robots of all kinds have been adopted during COVID.
Right.
And drones, drone delivery was a big one, and it was more for the medical getting samples to the labs, because the hospital's over here, and you put your laboratory way over on the bad side of town in the warehouse, and trying to get there, speed that up.
Yep.
So high density, and you start looking at the drone delivery of food and supplies. Suburbs, high density.
High density, high
We
population.
saw nothing for rural areas because there's not enough people to make it worthwhile. And so you're right about testing, and the safety of all of this scares me to death, because all the conversation so far has been about the mechanical parts and the aerodynamics. The software, people just believe anything software manufacturers tell them to, and I've got a PhD in computer science. Don't do that, kind of thing. It's so these are things to consider.
I agree. I mean, but there are rural communities, there are routes that are broken, and so if someone can figure out how we can get from point A to point B that is 100 miles apart, I do believe that that's going to blow up and make things work. But you're absolutely right? I mean, we go back into the technology. These aircraft can't fly very far for very long. So
this goes right back to the question of the business model.
Right, exactly.
And
But they do that.
Density.
And they do that in Africa, right? They're setting up travel lanes. These are dedicated to drones and the drone things, and you just have to worry about anybody just waiting to grab the drone and hijack it when it lands. But
that's a whole
but that's a different issue.
When we get talking about delivery, and you're absolutely right. It's this whole safety issue. Same thing with, especially in certain parts of the world with food delivery, and it's the whole security of it once you get it there. The water, the food, who's going to keep that secure, which is now a whole other part of this infrastructure.
Well, how are you going to keep it cold or hot? It depends on what you're delivering too.
And again, they've got specialized units for that. That's a nice mechanical engineering issue, right? With your power and stuff. But relatively well understood.
Yeah. Well, I want to touch on this as well, Robin. We talk about all the things that surround the industry, especially as it relates to BVLOS. And you mentioned UTM earlier. We'll come back to that. But let's talk about detect and avoid in 5G. I work very closely with these two for obvious reasons. But from your perspective, how do those two things play into this? And they're both at different stages of development. One very heavily driven by the large telecoms, and the other one is really kind of back to what Lori was saying. This is the DAA piece with her coming from Iris, great company. But how startup driven? How does all that meet and come together from your perspective?
It's still pretty scattered from what we're seeing. We ran the first streaming of a drone for a live disaster during the Kilauea volcanic eruption. And that's great. Volcanic eruptions are over there, and all the wireless infrastructure is still intact. You go to something like Hurricane Ian, even with all the FirstNet and all the different groups in, we still didn't have enough bandwidth. In the first 4 days, we had over 50,000 images of just the overall Fort Myers area to upload for about 800 gigabytes. So, that's not something 5G is built to handle that level. And so anything you can get out in, more edge computing, things that you can do, but that's a pretty big ask. And that's after, and then you think about what's happened with the wireless meeting. We tried to do something similar during that, and this is our work with Florida State as part of the Center for Robot Assisted Search and Rescue during the Champlain Towers, the Surfside collapse in Miami. Miami Beach, not exactly a place that doesn't have wireless communication and cell phone. Again, you could not get the throughput you needed to do some of this. So this really adds a challenge. So the things we see going back now to the detect and avoid. So there's detect and avoid. That's fun. We've seen where we were out at Hurricane Michael, almost had a collision with someone who was flying their drone just to check out their property damage as we were on a mission. So you've got a little bit of that. But when you start flying for certain missions like infrastructure, being able to not hit anything in front of you isn't as challenging as the things you forget about. As humans, we got to worry about this dimension and on the sides. And typically we've lost our peripheral vision, particularly if we're looking at a small screen. We don't have the same senses. And so we really need a 360 detect and avoid. So, and those are some of the challenges that I think still need to be worked. But again, wireless is going to be a huge one. I think that's where making the robots smarter, and at the same time making them, testing and evaluating them in a way that we can trust them, that it's not a nonsensical, oh, we built it, we're really smart, trust us. Or in the case of an early drone, one of the Navy's drones shut down Reagan National Airport, and it flew off course. It was somebody had given it the wrong waypoints, and they said, well, it's autonomous. We're not really responsible. It made its own decision. It's like, no, try again. No, right. that was a you. That's your software.
Right.
Yeah, kind of thing. And so you do that often enough, everybody just backs away from the technology because they can't trust it, because the testing and evaluations.
And as an operator, I mean, this raises a whole new issue around liability now.
For sure.
So we can probably expect our insurance rates to go through the roof once we get to BVLOS on autonomy. Looking forward to that.
Yeah.
What is your biggest concern right now in this space of BVLOS and it becoming a real reality? Like, what's like the one thing where you're like, this is something we've got to solve for us to feel comfortable at Spright?
Oh my goodness. I mean, again, there's a lot of things that keep me up at night. I just, I had the privilege and honor to be on the BVLOS Site Aviation Rulemaking Committee. I was the co-chair along with Sean Cassidy at Amazon. And we had endless conversations about this. And there's just, you can throw a dart on the wall and there's something that will keep people up at night. Right. But at the end of the day, I mean, we really need support from our federal agencies. We really need their buy-in to be able to, implement some of the recommendations that we created. Or we need some sort of consensus within these federal agencies so that we can solve these problems and get to a solution versus kicking it down the can or down the line or avoiding it or changing the topic. So I worry about just not enough people, not enough advocates, not enough freedom fighters, shall I say, within the various different agencies to make this work for industry across the United States and globally. Okay. So I'm concerned with that. Yep.
Last question. UTM, is that going to be a game changer for BVLOS?
Sure, if it ever happens.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, we're talking, and if you're trying to fly the smaller prosumer level drones, that becomes even more questionable how that works. But I think one of the things that happens with BVLOS, one of the great things about the transportation and utilities industry is they own their right-of-ways and they have relationships with the landowners. You try to fly a non-navigable river to understand flooding that's going to hit Houston, that's a lot of private land. That's a lot of people with shotguns wondering what you're doing.
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay. You know, shoot the bird, shoot at you, you know, those kinds of things, lock gates. So what happens, you know, what's the reliability? What happens when something has to make an emergency landing? What's the rules on that? You know, and that can cause a lot of regulatory pressures. But the thing I think, you know, from the previous talk and from what you're saying, Eileen, is I think that more than training the next generation of operators, is we need to get everybody into these agencies, or train the agencies. We've seen so many times when we've tried to get through COAs and things, it was clear that it was inexperienced people who weren't familiar with drones. They were either coming from the civilian crewed aviation or just there kind of stuff. And that gap, it makes it really hard to be visionary. It really makes it hard to adapt to regulations if we don't have a regulatory experience level.
That's right. Absolutely. We could do this all day. I have so many more questions, but we've run out of time. Thank you both so much. We are with Dr. Robert Murphy and Eileen Lockhart live at CES in Las Vegas with Women in Drones. We'll be right back.